I'm Erin Buckwalter, and today I'm here with Cathy Albisa, co-founder and executive director of Partners for Dignity and Rights, formerly known as the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, or NESRI. Thanks for being here and talking with me, Cathy.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Yeah. Well, first off, I was hoping you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work with Partners for Dignity and Rights. So kick us off.
Well, we see ourselves as a social movement support organization. We work with communities around the country, including several partners here in Vermont, to advance a long-term vision that's grounded in exactly what our name says, dignity and rights. We started out as the Economic and Social Rights Initiative in 2004 because it was a time when it was very difficult to get people to even talk about economic and social rights as part of the full spectrum of rights we should all have. That's changed a lot, but we continue now trying to get them achieved in practice because we clearly still have a long way to go.
Yeah, that makes sense. And last year in September, it looks like your organization published a new social contract for workers report. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what is a social contract and why it's needed.
A social contract as originally conceived, and we're trying to use it a little differently because the world has changed. But a social contract as originally conceived is sort of the deal, the set of assumptions that people hold as to what's expected of them and what's expected of their government. So what is that relationship, right, between the individual and government, and what are the sets of obligations and responsibilities and rights that relationship expresses? In the 20th century, you could say that the last social contract came out of the New Deal. And there was an expectation that government would create at least opportunity, that government would have a social safety net, that government would take responsibility for managing the economy, which was something that was not true prior to the 30s. But the New Deal did have some flaws, right? It was a compromise between labor and capital. It was pretty racially exclusionary, and all those flaws were exploited by the far right, by the corporate right over years, until I think everyone would agree that contract is pretty much unraveled at this point. So this project is about what kind of new social contract do we want. But this time, we also need to think about not only looking at a contract in such individual terms as the person and government, but rather what's the responsibility of communities as a whole, what's the responsibility of local government versus federal. Yes, where does the individual fit in, but what about all these other institutional actors? And one could say what's more of a multipolar social contract that's grounded in the values that we want to see expressed.
So can you tell me like the main points of the social contract and how it works?
So we originally published a report that hit 5 key sectors. One of them was labor. Okay. So that report came out in May of 2018, and you can see it on our website at dignityandrights.org. And some months later, we tried to drill down on the labor piece with a number of allies like the National Employment Law Center and Rights and Democracy here in Vermont, and Judge with Justice and the Center for Popular Democracy. And what it looks at is how can we ensure a human right to decent work in with greater economic democracy. So we looked at 3 big values, and we said, well, if work is a human right, we should have a federal jobs guarantee. No one should be desperate for work and not find it, especially in a society that tells you that if you're not working, it's your fault. And especially in a society that does not provide enough decent jobs as the economy is currently constructed. You might not know this, but the federal policy is actually shoots for more or less, not directly, but indirectly by trying to control inflation in a particular way, ends up shooting for 4% unemployment. That's millions of people chronically unemployed. And that doesn't include the people that they gave up looking. Right. That's considered full employment. And yet we turn around and tell people, if you're not working, you're not deserving. Right. So if we're going to expect people who are able-bodied to work, work should be a human right. Decent work should be a human right, at least a livable wage, with unionization, with decent benefits. That was one pillar, making work a human right. But we also want to make the workplace more democratic. We want people, our movements want people to have more agency, more power in their day-to-day lives. And so we also looked at things like, what does bargaining look like at scale? Because employers are working at scale. Corporations are getting more concentrated every day. Corporate supply chains are outsourcing jobs more every day. So the company that controls your day-to-day life may not even be your direct employer. So how do we reorganize our bargaining system so that workers can bargain vertically all the way to the top of a supply chain without laws getting in their way, actually enabling them to do that, and bargain with an entire sector. The labor movement's calling for that. Worker centers are asking for more space to bargain in supply chains because low-wage workers are often at the bottom. That was the second pillar. And the third pillar is an employer should not be able to determine access to other human rights, like health care, like being able to care for your family, child care, elder care. So you have to consider public benefits a matter of workers' rights. Universal health care, universal child care, universal elder care is what liberates a worker to be able to fulfill their full potential as a worker and to be free to move from employer to employer. So those were the three big ideas. And then there's so much wrong with the system that there's pages and pages of specific policies that should all be considered and can be. During Lyndon Johnson's tenure, 200 laws were passed in 2 years. So it is possible for a really active Congress to transform a sector.
Yeah. And did your contract touch on the human right to food at all? I'm just curious.
In the original social contract report, we had a section on land resources and housing, which is not about the labor piece, although we did lift up farm worker activism as examples of best practice in the social contract for worker report. In the original social contract report, what we talked about is how we need to rethink our relationship to land, and by definition, that affects the food system. You know, we talked about community control. We talked about community land trusts. Did you know that the first community land trust in this country was established by farmers in Northeast Georgia, by black farmers trying to sort of come together collectively to preserve their ability to produce food? Right. And so we lift up the community land trust model as a model for land that we need to grow because it's proven to be sustainable, immune from speculative forces, and creates community, which we desperately need in this country at this point in time.
Yeah, great. And what have been some obstacles you've seen to implementing this social contract, given that we live in a free market society, and how are you positioning yourself to overcome those obstacles?
The obvious obstacles, and anyone will say, well, yeah, right? The concentration of corporate power, the concentration of wealth, the capture of democracy by the right, the big money in democracy, all those things are true. And I think your audience is sophisticated enough not to need to hear an explanation as to why those are all obstacles. But there's something else that we need to keep in mind, which is also an obstacle, which is our political imagination. You cannot go somewhere that you have not imagined in your mind, that you have not seen in your mind. And for the last 40 years, the neoliberal model has cast shadows, and white supremacy has cast shadows over our political imagination. We have not been able to come together around a larger alternative and think about how to make that real. We can only fight those first obstacles if we exercise that muscle, along with all the other strategies we know, working collectively, building people power, organizing, getting people engaged, educating, all that is true. But without political imagination, we will be stymied.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You're here this weekend at the 2020 NOFA Winter Conference, and you're discussing worker-driven social responsibility models of addressing worker rights abuses in global supply chains. And I was hoping you could explain how this model works and give an example of it in practice.
Well, one of my favorite examples is right here. Migrant Justice runs the Milk with Dignity program here in Vermont. How it works is it flips market power on its head and uses market power to actually give workers power rather than take it away. So how does that work? Buyers at the top of supply chains actually are the ones that determine, by their pricing, by their practices, by their expectations, the terms and conditions of work at the bottom of a supply chain. Workers at the bottom of the supply chain, let's look at Vermont and dairy farms. Dairy farms are struggling. Whether you have a farmer that in his or her heart really wants to provide the best working conditions possible, or you don't, you have one that's recalcitrant, is less important than what is actually possible in the economic structure of dairy. The only entities that can change that economic structure are at the top. So in this model, workers at the bottom enter into a legally binding agreement at the top. And that legally binding agreement includes standards that have to be followed by all the suppliers in the chain for workers. It includes wall-to-wall monitoring by a worker organization. The workers themselves oversee the monitoring system.
I like that.
And most importantly, a complaint system that if there is a persistent violation, because this is not a got you model. This is not like the law where you want to sue somebody and get money. No. This is a model where you identify a problem, you give an employer an opportunity to correct it, and if they correct it, there is no penalty because it's about prevention. But if there is a persistent violation or what we call a zero tolerance offense like forced labor, the contract is cut. And those market consequences are more effective as incentives than anything we have ever seen. They've dramatically transformed the tomato sector on the eastern seaboard, and it will dramatically over time transform the dairy industry as well. So you have worker-to-worker education, monitoring by an organization that workers oversee and control, even though it's an independent monitor, but the workers get to choose it. A legally binding contract. We do not believe in standards without enforcement. Voluntary agreements have proven to be worse than nothing. And a complaint system that is effective and quick. That is worker-driven social responsibility.
Yeah, awesome. So if someone that was listening to us today was interested in getting involved in supporting your efforts, what would we tell them to do?
If you are here in Vermont, I would tell them to reach out to Migrant Justice. If you want to do, if you want to support the national effort, and this is an international effort, it goes from Bangladesh. The programs we have now are in Bangladesh, Lesotho, Immokalee, and Vermont. And we are talking to groups here and around the world about how to expand it and replicate it. And there are campaigns already in construction. If you want to get involved nationally as a researcher or in some other way, write me. And I will put you in touch with our network and our worker-driven social responsibility staff. And our website is dignityandrights.org, and all our emails are right there.
Okay, great. And what role do you hope that NOFA Vermont and similar organizations will play in the future of agriculture and food systems in this region?
There has been an increasing awareness and understanding, which I think is crucial, that sustainable food has to include people, right? That labor, people, the people that produce our food, their lives need to be sustainable. All our lives need to be sustainable. We need a sustainable food system to have a sustainable planet, to have thriving neighborhoods. Workers at the bottom of those food chains need to be part of it. And I think there has been an increasing commitment towards that end. And I think that holistic vision, all of us to embrace it together, is what we need from the food systems community and what I think is currently being offered. And the labor movement, the worker center movement, the farm worker movement is very grateful for it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add that I didn't ask about today?
I mean, I just want to say Vermont is a very special place. It leads the way in a lot of firsts, in a lot of transformative models and systems, from your community land trust in Burlington, which is a pretty good example, from the healthcare campaign that got almost all the way to the finish line but has deeply influenced the national debate. Vermont does a lot around environment and food. It can do the same for worker-driven social responsibility. It could become the this tip of the spear to transform the dairy industry. And this small state punches above its weight, and that is just something I would like to end with and recognize.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you. And I would like you to just one more time say your website so that people can find you when they want to learn more.
Dignityandrights.org.
Okay.
We just changed our name from Nesri to Partners for Dignity and Rights, and I hope you like our new website because it took us a while to get it together.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much, Cathy. It was really fun talking with you.
Okay, thank you.